Hello Steelers, and welcome to this video in which I'm going to show you how I built and painted these 15mm Sherman tanks. They're by Battlefront and they came in the Hit the Beach box set for Flames of War. I won't be using them for Flames of War, but they're still very useful for my needs. I won them as part of the Caesar Awards by Little Wars TV, and I just thought I'd get these built up and also show you a video of how I did it. So without further ado, let's jump in and enjoy the video. Obviously the first part is you actually have to build the things. What I do is I will use some snippers, plastic snippers, to cut out the bits from the actual sprue itself. I'll gather all the pieces together for the particular tank so I can easily build them once they're there, rather than cutting one piece off at a time as I'm building them. So you can see here, these are the hull parts. They're very nicely designed, the Battlefront plastics. They're well worth getting if you like 15mm wargaming figures. Very simple to build as well, with great instructions. And then once I'd clipped everything off as well, I just cleaned off all the little nubs from the sprue as well, just with the edge of a blade. Don't do it too hard here because you will cut through the plastic. It is quite soft, so it's a lot easier just to kind of scrape it off and just almost sanding with the edge of the blade. Just do that with everything so you know that everything is going to fit together nice and easily. And then simply it was just a case of putting them together, really, using polyliquid. Here you can see, so it melts the plastic and creates a stronger bond. Use this stuff rather than, say, super glue, especially on plastics anyway. I also dry fit them as well beforehand, just so you know where a part is going to go. And just using the little brush that comes with the polystyrene cement, just make sure you've got enough on each of the joints so that when they have dried, and they don't take very long to dry, there will be a solid bond. I'd probably leave them 24 hours, but you can work on them a little bit quicker than that if you want, but just to get that solid bond of the glue, I'd probably give them 24 hours. And then we started to move on to the painting. Now what I do here is I will super glue the tanks to some old Vallejo bottles. You can see here how it's joined on. I have used blue tack in the past to hold them down, but the problem is the blue tack sometimes can get a little unstuck and the tank will fall off. I find with super glue it'll hold it, and the good thing with super glue and plastic is that super glue is actually brittle, so you can quite easily snap off the tanks at the end, and because you don't look underneath the tanks you don't actually see where the join is anyway. I've also added a lot of stowage. There was some that was included in the set, but I've also got quite a lot myself, and Sherman tanks, whenever you see them in combat, they're always covered in some kind of stowage, so I just put plenty on there. I then decided to undercoat these tanks. Sometimes I don't, sometimes I do. This time I did. Using my airbrush, I just sprayed them in light grey just to give them a nice base coat and to bring all that stowage and extra bits together as well. So cover up any glue spills or anything like that as well. Quite easily just working your way through, and obviously do the turrets at the same time as well. And sticking with the airbrush, I then swapped to Vallejo's US Dark Green as my undercoat. I use various different colours really for the undercoat. Sometimes I'll use brown violet or various other dark greens, because tanks rarely are the same colour, even if they come from the same factory. Different recipes of paints are used. They're supposed to use the same one, but then you also get weathering, different climatic circumstances change the colours as well, so I wouldn't worry too much as long as it looks all right to you. And as I say, in this case, the US dark green looked perfectly fine, so I'll just cover the entire tanks in this. Just make sure I'm not missing any spots, getting underneath all the in around the tracks and everything. The good thing about Allied tanks, American and British tanks in particular, is you don't really have to do a great deal of work on them to make them look okay. You've got that green on already, so I'm using that, and then what I've done is as a base coat, and then I've also taken NULN oil, Games Workshop's wash, and liberally applying this all over the tank, as you can see here. Very simply just getting it in all to the nooks and crannies and make sure it fills up all those little lines and panels and things that you can see. This is a great wash. It really gets into all the lines and the panels and everything, and I thoroughly recommend it. It's definitely worth paying a little bit extra for it. I've never come across a better wash than this. I mentioned brown violet earlier. Well, I actually used it to dry brush these tanks. So I basically get my brown violet, put it into the palette, and then get a large makeup sized brush, nice big and soft, dip it into the paint, get as much off the paintbrush itself as you can, and then lightly go over the tank, and you can see it starts to pick out those colours of the edges of all the bits and pieces, like the rivets and the panels and things, and just picking out the highlights of the edges, and also helping to soften down that NULN oil quite a lot. So I do this with all of the tanks. As you can see, very, very simple job. This is a basic technique when it comes to painting. It's well worth learning and having as part of your painting arsenal, just because it adds that little extra shading that is very useful, especially for tanks where they have large flat panels. Once I'd done that, you notice here as well that I'd added decals as well at one point in the process. That was just before the dry brushing, so I could actually dry brush over the top of them just to give them a slightly faded look. I then started to paint the stowage, painting this in various greens and browns. The scrimmage, the stuff that you can see here, which is used for camouflaging from the air, I painted this in a dark green. I think it was probably German dark green, camo dark green perhaps, but it's any colours you want really. Again, you can use here, it really makes no difference. Just apply this with a small brush and try to be as neat as possible and go through all the bits of stowage that you have on these vehicles. The good thing about stowage is that you can use it to break up the shape of the vehicle. You can also add a little splash of colour as well. That's particularly important on allied vehicles because they are generally monocolour. As you can see, these ones are green. So painting browns and khakis and other greens onto those stowage just gives it a little bit of interest as well on the tabletop. I was then ready to begin painting the black for the tracks, so just making sure I was quite neat around the top of the tracks on the edges there where you can see it's up against the side of the hull. I just basically painted these in a base black. This is the quickest and easiest way to do tracks. Just running your entire paintbrush around the edge and making sure you don't go over the wheels too much if you can avoid it, and also on the hull, as I said, the hull side. I wouldn't worry too much about being incredibly neat because you can use weathering later on just to disguise some of the mistakes that you make anyway. So, but you know, it's obviously better to be neat in the first case so you don't have to disguise stuff, but I wouldn't worry too much. So I do the edges and then I just go back and do the actual flat, larger flat part of the track as well. As you can see there, you can be a lot quicker with that bit than you can on the edge. And then I move on to weathering or washing the stowage. So I'm just using AGRAX Earthshade here and literally just splashing this all over all of the different individual pieces of stowage. You can dry brush this once it's dry. I don't bother because I think it has a nice dirty look then anyway, but if you want to, you can really just sharpen it up a little bit with a dry brush, but I wouldn't worry too much about it because the AGRAX itself gets right into the folds of the cloth as well. It's as good stuff as the NULN oil, and again, well recommended buying. And the allied tanks are incredibly simple, and that is literally all you need to do for the painting. Again, you could go crazy if you want to and do lots more detailing on there, but I generally don't. All I'm doing here at this point is now just weathering it. I'll get some khaki and dry brush it as a tide line around the bottom of the tank. Again, weathering is entirely up to the individual. You can put as much or as little on as you want. I put this on in kind of a dusty way just because you're going to get dust and things kicking up on tanks. They're not going to be completely covered in mud because they will get washed off in rain, and also the tank crews will wash them off as well when they're in their service depots and things, so they're not going to be absolutely filthy. So this is just enough for me. Again, you do what you want when it's your tank, but this is enough to, again, just to bring out some of those slight details around the tracks and also on the wheels as well. Then the final stage is to apply some matte varnish. This is Winsor & Newton Professional Artist Matte Varnish, the best on the market as far as I'm concerned, and it's worthwhile paying that little bit extra just for this stuff. Make sure you have a box or an area that you can spray in, and it's also ventilated, and you're wearing gloves and masks and all that kind of thing. But this doesn't take very long to do, just to quickly get them all sealed in and then leave them to dry for maybe probably not even that long really, but I'd leave them for 24 hours before doing much else with these. My next and final job was to make the bases for the vehicles. A lot of people don't like basing vehicles, but I do. I think it just adds a little extra dimension to them. There's two schools of thought in wargaming on whether you should base vehicles or not. I always do. So basically I just measure the tank, see how big it is, then measure out on a piece of styrene. This I think is 2 or 3 mil thick, and just make sure that I've got it all measured out, ready to cut out into strips for the tanks. And then using a sharp blade, just ensure that you can cut these out. The good thing about styrene is you only need to do a couple of passes with the blade, and then you can actually snap it as well. So it's quite an easy thing to cut and to work with. Well worth getting. You can get it from most hobby stores, and I use it in all kinds of builds, not including bases, but also for buildings and things like that as well. Then the final thing to do with the base really is just to clip off those edges, just so you don't have such a stark right angle. I will then smooth those down as well, just to give it a slightly rounded base rather than, as I say, the sharp right angles. And then it's the final stage with the base, and using this Vallejo earth texture, which is basically paint with a bit of a grain in it, so it's got some texture. I will just daub this onto the bases themselves, and this will I'll use this as my base underneath the flocking that I'm going to do later on. But I generally do these in 2 sessions, so I'll do the first half of the base, let that dry, and then come back and do the last half, so I've got something I can hold on to without getting the texture all over my fingers. And then it's the final bit of the base, so I'm using PVA, which I've slightly watered down here, and I daub this all over the base, over the top of that texture, and then I will dip this into the static grass, which you can see a box of in the back there. There's lots of different colours of static grass. You can use what you want. Some people only put patches of static grass and things onto their bases. I generally cover them entirely in it because it matches the board that I have, which is a grass green one, so that's why I do it. And then the very final stage is just use some super glue to glue them down onto those grass bases. Just make sure that you line up the tank perfectly well with the edges so it's not skew whiff on either side. Press it down a little bit. The super glue should only take a couple of seconds to set. You could use polystyrene cement here, but super glue I find is better, and it's just a better bond overall. And there we have it. 8 Shermans. Some of these are the 75mm version, some of these are the 76mm version. I just did a mix, but you can see there, as I say, I've not dry brushed any of that stowage. The American tanks are relatively easy to paint. The stowage really breaks up the shape of the tanks themselves, so they all don't look particularly uniform, and they just look nicer and more attractive on the tabletop. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. These were really nice to build, real pleasure. They're lovely little tanks full of detail and character. If you have liked this one, please check out my other videos, and if you have watched this and you haven't subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps me. Also check out my Patreon, and also check me out on Twitter. And once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.